and the director here at the Hurt Hub at Davidson. Thank you all for joining us. I just wanted to give you a warm welcome and introduce you to what the Hurt Hub is and does very briefly. We exist to facilitate access and exposure to innovation and entrepreneurship for all. Our values are freedom, integrity, and inclusion. And it's our pleasure to welcome these speakers here tonight who will be introduced in just a moment by our partners launch of Fang. We're so excited to welcome open debate and discussion in the spirit of innovative thinking. So thank you all who are joining us here in person, who are joining us on the live stream, or perhaps watching this as a recording. Thank you, and I will turn it over to Graham Bullock.
Hello everyone, my name is Graham Bullock. I'm a professor of political science here at Davidson College, and first wanted to support this great event. It's a really fascinating topic, and I look forward to hearing more about it from our speakers. And in the spirit of that debate, I wanted to talk to you about something called the Deliberative Citizenship Initiative. But first, I want to ask a couple questions of all of you. So, how many of you are hesitant about talking about politics with members of your family? How about your friends? How about in the office? How about with strangers? I see all. Now, how many would you like to be able to discuss the most important kind of political and social issues of our day with your friends, with your family, with your colleagues, with strangers? So this is the sort of motivation for the Deliberative Citizenship Initiative. What we're trying to do is launch the DCI, Deliberative Citizenship Initiative, was launched 2 years ago to create spaces and opportunities for people to come together and talk about and engage with each other on controversial but critically important issues facing our communities and our society. And it's designed to rejuvenate our sense of citizenship and our sense of public discourse. Moving from a sense of citizenship as what passports you hold to a sense of the work that we do together to solve the problems facing our community. And also transforming our sense of public discourse as debate and crosstalk to one of real genuine dialogue and deliberation. And so to transcend the polarization that permeates our politics, to go to that point that Liz made about innovative ideas and transcendent solutions to these really hard challenges. And so what do? Just quickly, so we do 5 main things. So we host forums, deliberative forums. One actually we have tomorrow night on free speech and inclusion. It's online, virtually you can sign up still on Eventbrite. Go to our website, deliberativecitizenship.org, which, and then go to events and then upcoming events, and there's a link right there. We've got a great panel of experts from Dartmouth, Yale, and Princeton, followed by small group deliberations, small group discussions hosted by our DCI facilitators. We have one of them here tonight, Sandra, who was a fellow last year with DCI. And we also host what we call D teams, deliberative D teams, which are small groups that meet once a month to get to know each other and then engage also on these hard challenges, hard topics, facilitated again by fellows and facilitators like Sandra. We also train facilitators, students, faculty, staff, and members of the community. We had 40 trainees this past September go through a training workshop, set of workshops. And then we also host speakers on deliberation, on deliberative democracy. So if you want to learn more, go to our website. You can sign up for our newsletter, blog post that will send you at the end at the bottom of each page. You can sign up very easily, and you'll get updates on all of these types of events. And we're trying to collaborate, have students and community members and faculty and alumni all engage in these conversations, both virtually and in person. So we hope that you'll consider coming to our events, and then pay attention in particular. We're having a deliberative forum probably in February on economic mobility and the American dream. What are the best ways by which we can ensure all Americans have access to that dream? So stay tuned for that, and thank you for the few minutes, Chris and Liz, and I'll try.
Thank you very much. Everybody, I'm only going to talk for a couple minutes, and I'm going to shut up and turn it over to our speakers here. Should I move? I don't really know. Am I screwing up? Tonight's topic is, and I'll read the title to everyone, I know it's on the invite, is surveillance capital the cause or cure for fake news? And then the following question is, in a divided society, what role should technology play in defining what information is true? This is pretty broad in terms of a topic, and this conversation could go any number of directions tonight. I'm really curious to see where it takes us. But the thing that I struggle with, and part of the reason that prompted this, is that there's so much of how we interact with the world and how we see the world today is driven by the internet. And the internet is largely driven by an advertising model, where everything is free, but then you're sold or you're presented with ads. And then that has created this phenomenon where the companies that are selling those ads, whether it's the New York Times or CNN or Facebook or Instagram or what have you, it creates a couple of incentives. The first is that they want to slice and dice data so that a marketer can sell exactly the thing to you that you want to buy at just the right time and not to someone else, right? They want the pair of shoes that you want to buy, you're presented with, but the pair of shoes that I don't want to buy, I never see. So you have these highly targeted ads. But on top of that, the other incentive is they want you to spend as much time as possible on whatever their platform is on the internet, because that's more opportunity to serve up those ads a certain percentage of the time, a certain amount of your eyeball share is dedicated to that. And I think all of those are concepts that I can grasp, but then there's these unpredictable and hard for me to understand second and third order effects where you have, I think of it like if the weather app on my phone started creating its own weather, because like to some extent, you're not just being served up ads on Facebook, you're not just being served up titles in the New York Times or whatever news publications you happen to read. There's incentives on the part of those platforms because they want to keep your eyes there. They show you things that are most relevant to you to keep you on them longer, but over time that starts to change your opinions. And that brings me back to the question we have for tonight's evening is how do you know what's true? And a whole lot of what society has struggled with over the past number of years is just commonly coming to an understanding of what is accepted as true. There's a big chunk of the country that says President Biden wasn't fairly elected last November, a year ago today, I think. And then there's a big chunk of the country that says, that's crazy, of course he was fairly elected. And we can't even agree on really, really basic things. And so our two speakers tonight have experience, and I'm gonna read you their bios here momentarily and then be quiet, but that's what I'm curious to learn more about, because it's honestly something that I struggle to understand. I can't wrap my head around all the different dimensions that this takes. I hope that I'm not alone, or I assume that I'm not alone, but in kind of just that broader understanding. And so better to bring in two folks who are really smart on this and have them talk about it. So just to read you their bios, so Michael Slavey here is an American entrepreneur, currently serving as the chief strategist at New York-based nonprofit Harmony Labs. He previously ran the Chicago-based startup he founded, Tin Shell. He was CTO of Barack Obama's 2008 campaign. He is author of For All the People, Redeeming the Broken Promises of Modern Media and Reclaiming Our Civic Life. There's copies of it available for sale out front if you want it. Copies signed by Mike. And then sitting next to Michael, we've got Harrison Tang. He's the CEO and co-founder of Spokeo. He started Spokeo with his college roommate in 2006 in his parents' basement. Harrison guides Spokeo's product vision to help the company realize its mission of making the world around us more transparent with data, user data. Under his leadership, Harrison has helped build and scale Spokeo's user base from zero to serving tens of millions of users. And I will add an additional sentence to that. If you're not familiar with what Spokeo is, they have data, and maybe Harrison can speak more to this, they have data about members of the population. So if you wanted to look up, I don't know, maybe somebody's phone number, you could presumably go on his platform and be able to do that. And there's other data that his platform. So while not Facebook, he exists in the orbit of tech companies that have user data and what they do with it, and sort of the ethics and morality around that, which is, it's very easy to throw all those companies under the bus and say that they're evil. But there's I think there's a very valid case that what they're doing is in many ways beneficial to the world, where it's a tool, and like any tool that can be used positively or negatively. And so Again, I'm really curious to hear where this conversation goes tonight. I'm going to start it off, I guess, Michael, do you want to go first? And then we'll see. And I hope that this can turn into a dialogue with audience participation. So we'll get a chance to chime in here a little later. Thanks, guys. No, that's right.
No.
Thanks, Chris. Did you get a good sound? Everything sound okay? Thanks for coming, everybody. It's nice to be in person. Like, this is so wonderful to be on a college campus and to be here and to see some people face to face and have this conversation. I think as a place to start and thinking about the role that the tools that we use for consuming information, for telling stories play in our everyday lives, you know, the question about sort of what is true sort of is something that we can engage with, you know, from a lot of different dimensions. Because we are sort of technologists and people who are interested in the utilization of technology in a lot of different mechanisms, I think the sort of more epistemics and philosophical conversation is something we can talk about the nature of truth. But I think part of what we see based on the tools that we use to interact with the world and consume information is this question about like how they define our worldview. And I think one of the fundamental truths about mass information, all the way back to Gutenberg printing press in the 15th century, is that the stories that get told and that get mass attention are sort of driven by an economics of attention. And I think we associate the negative consequences of that most with the things that are most current, social media. I think these are questions that pervade all of the systems that we use to consume all of the stories that we consume that help us define culture, help us define the stories and narratives that help us make sense of the world. And so much sort of in the Yuval Harari view of humanity and anthropology, so much of our understanding of the world is based on fiction, our capacity to make up concepts that help us organize the world and to sort of collaborate at large scale, right? The United States of America, it's not a naturally occurring phenomenon. It's a thing we made up. There is a story that we have created in society about a nation state and about a country. And that story is communicated through mechanisms of media. And that started with conversation. It led to the printed word. That led to the sort of evolution of media has been this sort of constant accruing of new channels and new mechanisms of telling stories. And I think what we see now is that there's this additional layer in a social landscape where rather than just thinking about fragmentation and who is where, and we are disconnected from a shared conversation because there's too many channels, too much fragmentation, which was sort of the narrative of media through the 90s, sort of 80s and 90s. We're now in a world where the basic architecture of the sharing of information is actually quite different than a sort of vertical channel-based hierarchical way of seeing the world. And that graph, the network that we live in of all these interconnected fragments has very different norms than the things that we relied on to make sense of the stories that help us make sense of the world. And there are things missing from the graph that we used to rely on to help us understand things like truth, to help us understand what is credible, who is authoritative. We actually really lack good markers for those concepts, right? In an older architecture of sort of gatekeeper-based hierarchies and channels, we relied on editors and newsrooms and things to make some of those choices for us. As their power has decreased in the graph, we haven't replaced them with effective markers that we trust. And so we've started to rely on things like proximity as substitutes for other principles that actually proximity is a terrible substitute for. Right? The fact that I hear something a lot doesn't mean it's more true. The fact that it's close to me or comes from someone who looks like me doesn't mean that person's authoritative. And so when we live in a world where the selection of things that we consume is driven by a lot of the incentives that Chris described around sort of maximizing attention, that is not the same as maximizing truth, understanding, empathy. There are any number of other things that we want in a public sphere that we may consider important for the effective for an effective society or a productive society or inclusive society that's not represented in the incentives that drive how our worldview is shaped by tools that are opaque to us. And then we combine that with sort of the shareability of the graph, the lack of clear markers for things like authority and credibility, and we are sort of at sea, right? All of us. I mean, I think everyone, no matter how much time you spend studying information or systems, no matter how well you understand these algorithms, no matter how much you may try to resist this sort of incredible inertia of sort of this sort of like incredible attention engagement mechanism, it's actually quite hard to have healthy dialogue. It's actually, because it turns out as a mechanism of maximizing inventory, things like outrage and confirmation bias are more effective ways to keep you clicking in a system than nuanced, careful exploration of the boundaries of your ideas. Turns out that's not as good at getting you to click. Turns out that's emotionally challenging. It's psychologically difficult. And as people, we also crave a sense of belonging. We crave a psychological safety of feeling like we have a coherent understanding of the world around us. And it leads us in these directions, and the platforms are, consciously or not, really taking advantage of that psychology. And ultimately, the things that we most rely on for a public sphere, in the best sense of the word, we're not getting from tools that could be providing us with a vastly more complete view of the world than we have ever had the opportunity to have. This is one of what I consider sort of one of the huge missed opportunities so far of greater connectivity, is that it could be leading to a much more complete conversation, a much more nuanced conversation and understanding of humanity and each other and people and greater empathy and all these other pieces that we sort of naively, I think, in the early days of the internet and social media, believed were inherent to greater connectivity. I think what we are discovering is that design and business incentives and business models are not neutral. And therefore, if the values and principles and things that we want from these systems are not explicitly made requirements of the systems, we're not implicitly going to get all of them. And I think that's the world the conflict we're in right now is we're not getting what we wanted, what we feel like we need. And how do we demand from these systems the things that we do need, and what does that look like? And that's ultimately where I think the collision of the sort of regulatory conversation around media starts to show up, and where for me, there's an opportunity to articulate in a public conversation the nature of our public demands for public goods about a public sphere that can be constraints on the design of new systems. Can be constraints. Entrepreneurs and innovators don't love blank pages, despite what they might tell you. Like, having constraints, having things to respond to actually helpful, right? And if there are public goods that we need out of these private systems, whether they're publicly traded or not, I mean, companies versus like governmental public entities, we need to tell them what we want, right? And if what we want is healthy, nuanced discourse, we need to make that something that is being designed for. It is not what it's being designed for, so we're not getting it. These systems are not broken. They are working as they were meant to work. They were working as they were designed for the benefit of their designers. And we need them to also provide other benefits. And so that's ultimately a public conversation that we have to take responsibility for, that our leaders need to take responsibility for, and people who understand this conversation need to get into that public conversation so that these values can be represented in sort of the next generation of technology that is sort of built on the sort of place where we are. We are not inexorably doomed to a hyper-polarized society unless we just turn off the internet. Like that is not a reasonable way of thinking about sort of where we are, as sort of dysfunctional as it all feels. So it was like a long way around, like trying to frame this in the context of the relationship between sort of technologies and what we need from them versus what they were designed for. And I think this is to where Chris started, and sort of the question that I have for Harrison around sort of the nature of the principles and mission and opportunity, like the intersection between sort of business incentives for a for-profit business and the recognition of the immense responsibility that comes from being part of the infrastructure of our public sphere. And I think that responsibility has been really embraced by some companies, or at least attended to, and been pretty ignored by others. And so I'm curious about how you see, as someone at the heart of and sort of tied into the underlying plumbing that makes these systems work, that makes the ability to do things like hyper-targeted advertising work, what the ethics and responsibility are inherent to that design process, and thinking about design as an expression of values and principles and not just as an exercise in sort of user optimization. Like that optimization is inherently biased toward a particular type of outcome, and how we help shift what those incentives are in a way that allows companies like yours to continue to grow and for us to get what we need out of a public sphere that is the only one we have, right? Like there isn't a going back.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And I think to answer this question, we need to kind of talk about how does the technology world work today. And by the way, Spokeo is not really a media company. Our monetization is not really engagement. We're a subscription model. So it is a little bit different. But I'll talk about the engagement model and how does the monetization in the tech industry work today first, and then I'll address what are the possible solutions to change this equation. So how it works today essentially is this model in marketing called STP. It stands for segment target positioning. So essentially the idea is that no humans are created equal, and you want to, everyone likes different things. Actually in marketing, we like to call it, we don't believe in averages, because average doesn't, for example, I'll just use a very classical example. Mobile and desktop, their monetization is 30% off. So mobile usually monetizes about 25 to 45%, around 30% lower than desktop. So when you're doing bids and you're doing averages, right, then you're going to underbid on desktop, and you're going to be overbidding and losing money on mobile audiences. And that's just a very classical example. You can do it with so many dimensions that is unbelievable, right? By device, by demographics, by behaviors. And actually one of the best ways to do it is by what you've done, because what you've done and your behaviors is a better indicator of what you will do than what you say you are, okay? So essentially, once you segment, then you need to prioritize, right, which segment you're going to target, and that's basically the core idea of targeting, and then you do positioning. And positioning means that for certain audiences, they like this, and then they will, how do I position my product, right, to cater to this audience? So that's a very, very classical STP model in marketing. And honestly, this model really summarizes how the tech industry has worked, right, in the last 20 years. Whether you call it personalization, whether you call it MarTech, some people like to use acronyms. It stands for marketing technologies and all that stuff. It's all pretty much the same, right? Some people even go to call it account-based marketing, marketing to the person one, okay? It's all the same. It's basically STP model, segment target positioning. And it works because all of us have different preferences, and when you're doing bidding, when you're doing monetization, if you do averages, you're always going to lose out. Okay? Now, one of the problems with STP is it creates a divisive society, obviously, right? Divisive audiences. You're perpetrating this idea that, hey, everyone's different, and then you target them, and then they don't know alternatives exist. Okay? one of the technologies that have made a lot of technology services very, very successful is called recommendation engine. I think all of you probably have heard that term. It's the secret to Facebook newsfeed. It's the secret to YouTube. And most recently, if you have read Wall Street Journal, it's the secret to TikTok success. Wall Street Journal just recently did an investigative report on TikTok's algorithms, how it actually, basically, their recommendation engine is tuned to the extent that if you are really into something, they will only show you that kind of thing, like 80, 90% of the time. Okay? If you have time, you can read through that. It's a fascinating story. Recommendation engine in computer science is a type of information filtering system. Okay? So think about that for a second. Recommendation engine, how it works, essentially is it's blowing up all the problem spaces and all the possibilities, and it filters what they think most likely that you are going to see or you are going to buy. So by definition, it creates a narrow-minded point of view, by definition, because it's a type of information filtering system. So whether it's the marketing side of things, STP, or technology side of things, recommendation engine, that's basically how it works. That's basically why the tech industry has been so successful. But the byproduct, and by the way, I don't think any of the technologists, when they first built recommendation engines, they're thinking about creating a divisive society. I'm not sure, I don't think, I'm a big believer that people are born good. So I don't think they have that intention. So the byproduct of a very, very strong recommendation engine, which is a very, very good information filtering system, is you will create this narrow-minded point of view. So how do we solve this? Well, it's easy said than done, right? But I think the solution is reintegration. It's the idea of integrate, right? In philosophy, there is this idea called false alignment, right? It's believing that there's only two paths, A and B. I once did a terrible thing that parents should never do, which is ask their kid, which one do you like better, daddy or mom? And by the way, don't do that, okay? Don't do that. And to my surprise, my son answered mommy and daddy. So all of us are born without this getting into being trapped. This ability, all of us are born with this ability that we won't get trapped by this false fallacy that is A and B. In fact, there is an answer called C. It's right in the middle, right? And that's why I call it integration. And how do we do that? I think it starts with awareness, right? Spokeo's mission is transparency. We need to be aware how these systems work, how all these data things work. We need to be aware if we're on the left, you need to be aware that the right exists. Spokeo has 6 core values. The first and most important value is listen with empathy. I always tell people I might not agree with what you said, but I will always 100% listen and acknowledge what you just said. And I think that's what needs to be done, right? Because right now, when you go to these technology platforms, all you see is these point of view and perspectives. And you're not aware that alternative perspective and solutions exist. So only with this awareness, then we can start working on how do we reintegrate these perspectives so that we can create a more cohesive society. So that's just a kind of a high-level solution to the problem that I'm proposing, to the problem that you proposed. But yes, you're right. I think the technology we created is very, very effective. But then at the same time, the byproduct is segmentation, is the divisive society that we created.
And if hyper-personalization, one of the sort of like unintended consequences of hyper-personalization is this sort of narrowing worldview, one of the questions there is like, who bears responsibility for the unintended consequence? And like where the responsibility to fix that comes in. Is it Facebook's responsibility? Is it Facebook's responsibility to, this word? That's good. Is it Facebook's responsibility?
Sorry.
No.
Here we go.
There we go. Is it Facebook? Wow. I love this. Is it Facebook's responsibility to show me the thing that it's been hiding from me? And why would they do that? Like, is it a good business decision for them to expand my worldview? That's the question, the incentives question that is like particularly problematic here is, in whose best interest is it for them to help us do this reintegration, right? Because in the graph that I described, all of our views of the world are unique. We have all the systems pushing us toward a unique view of the world. We lack a shared space for shared conversation and shared story. And then that can be taken advantage of if you're interested, for instance, in sort of other, like creating a sort of narrative about others, the danger about others. You add to that, for instance, a pandemic pressure where other people are dangerous. And now there's this other sort of weight coming into the conversation that is already pushing us apart, making other people dangerous, and the reintegration is awfully scary, right? So one of the things I think is important is that it may be the case that I actually really want Amazon to get the personalization right. Like I actually just, it really reduces the friction of my shopping experience in ways that I find super helpful, right? Like I love it when the new running shoes that I looked at on newbalance.com start following me around the internet and I start seeing them everywhere. And, okay, it's a little creepy, but there's a reduction of friction and a way of sorting information. We live in this state of cognitive overload that we need help with. And some of that hyper-personalization is really helpful. But all of our information is now sort of governed and driven by the same principles, the same incentives. And that's a place where I think there's an opportunity for intervention. When do we want this reintegration? When do we want to see nuance and alternatives and other things? To being constantly assaulted by challenging worldviews sounds exhausting, but it's probably an experience we need sometimes to ensure that we are getting what we need from these public systems. We're getting a sense of belonging and safety from a community that we are connected to, and we are getting challenged with a broader understanding of the rest of the world. We need both of those things. It just may be the case that it is just fine for TikTok to optimize, for Instagram to optimize my feed for like professional runners and baby Rottweilers, and that's just fine, that's okay. But it's probably not as good for society for someone who's worked on the left and as a professional democratic political operative to only hear, to experience complex public policy dialogue as a constant reinforcing of things that I already know from people I already agree with. Because it makes me believe that there are no alternative views of the world. If I go to my TV and I look at the cable menu and my TV learns that I don't want to watch Fox News and it stops giving me the option, the fact that I'm choosing not to watch Fox News is a cognitive choice. It helps me, even if I'm not consuming it, there is an understanding of another worldview. Now, engaging with that worldview with listening and empathy is another step. But not having the choice to not watch that is actually a problem for my understanding of the world, because now I don't think that exists. And there's a reality to the sort of dismissiveness that shows up in political discourse that these things, there just isn't anybody that thinks that way. And that just turns out to often not be the case. And so designing systems that are intentionally meant for discourse, that are intentionally going to give us experiences that we need, has to be part of the solution. I think Chris wants to jump in here.
There you go. There we go. I've got a first question here. Just interrupting
Please.
chime in. Folks in the audience, if you have a question, I'd say going forward, feel free to raise your hand. You can just kind of pass the mic around. But Bob tapped me on the arm and said you had questions. So.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I don't want to interrupt the flow, but I thought I would ask a question about an example that is actually not a technology example to see how it prompts the conversation here. Think about a small town in Vermont and a Walmart is proposed for construction. And citizens are up in arms and want to prevent that Walmart from being built. The Walmart gets built, a lot of people shop there. Would a more effective strategy for those citizens to be let the Walmart get built and not shop there? My point being, what the citizens that are protesting are really saying is, we don't want our neighbors to have a choice. So my question to you, if you buy that analogy, is who's the quote unquote bad guy in that scenario? Is it Walmart for building a building and making goods available? Or is it the citizens in their town that are willing to torch the small businesses because they can get a better deal at Walmart? And I do think it's analogous to this. We do what we like. So is it the tech companies that make things available to us that are the problem? Or is it all of us individually that can't see the betterment for society and just want to do what we like? How do we get around that question?
Yeah, so I think I understand your analogy, and since we're talking about truth, right, and what is truth, and how do we know what is true or what's not? So let me go with that first, and then I think that by answering these definitions, and by the way, we're a data company, so we like definitions. Like clarifying these definitions, I think I can offer a solution or some ideas on how do we solve that problem. So first of all, let's talk about truth, right? What is truth? Truth is a question of being. Philosophy is part of the metaphysics. And by the way, I'm not a philosopher, so I'm not trying to pretend to be. But it's a question of being. And the question of being is very, very complicated because if you look at this bottle, right, is it half empty, half full? You have different perspectives. And honestly, the truth and the question of being is beyond just what we see. Right? What we see here is three-dimensional. Actually, the truth involves multiple dimensions. In my belief, it has infinite dimensions. So what does that mean? I'll just give a common example. The fourth dimension is time, right? So this thing can be thrown in the trash can and got crushed. That's the fourth dimension. Another dimension is gravity. Albert Einstein says gravity distorts space-time continuum. Personality is a dimension. And actually, in data science, in Spokeo's world, identity, credit worthiness is a dimension. Okay? So there's infinite number of dimensions. The truth is that no one can really see the truth. Because if you live in a world where you can only see two dimensions, you would think it's a circle, and you would never know it's a bottle. Okay? Because we only see three dimensions, and we cannot see fourth dimension, we can never know what will happen to this water bottle. And using this analogy, even if you're someone who can see through time, you will still not have the visibility into personality traits, your credit, gravity, and many other things, okay? So my belief is truth is inherently higher dimension, and the truth is that all of us only see part of the truth, or what I call perspective. Okay? So now we kind of define what is truth, right? And let's talk about how do we know what is true and what is not. And how in philosophy is the question of epistemology and knowledge. And usually there's a couple of ways to do it. The first way is consistency, is majority rule. So for example, in blockchain, the truth is majority rule, okay? If the majority of the no, they call it consensus algorithm. If the majority of no says that this transaction, this block is true, it becomes true. And by the way, these nodes have no idea who these two accounts are. They have no credibility to say this transaction actually do exist. So when the majority of no in the network says true, it's true. Our judicial system works like that too, in many sense, I would argue. Right? In a jury trial, a lot of times it works like majority rule or 60-40 rule. So majority rule consistency, that's one way to do it. The other way is authority. Okay. But the problem now is who says who is authority? So there's multiple ways to do it. In famous PageRank, which is what Google is known for and how they got started, it's basically using links as votes and using graph analysis to figure out what's authority, right? So there's multiple ways to do it. The other way is coherence, right? So if I'm 5'3", most likely I'm not going to be 200 pounds, right? Something like that. So it's looking for outliers, or do you conform to a certain standards? So there's multiple criteria of truth. If you read it up, I think there's like 6 or 7 criteria. That's usually how do you know what is true and what is not. And using this analogy, I think probably offers how you're going to solve this problem. But ultimately, I don't believe that anyone can ever know the truth. We can get closer to it, but we can never know the truth because ultimately truth is infinite dimensions. Does that make sense?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think it's, maybe the question to follow up that is, well, I'll just repeat what I said earlier. Who's the bad guy?
Yeah, let me jump at this question around sort of fault in this sort of scenario, because I think that it obviously depends on your perspective, right? One of the challenges here about something like politics is that the same event, you're talking about half full, half empty, those are both interpretations of a set of facts. The facts are a bottle with an amount of water, and so much of the content that we engage with is interpretation and analysis of not fact. And our ability to distinguish which one we're being fed is actually quite difficult. Like, is what's on, I was making a joke earlier about Fox News and MSNBC and the cable, are we watching news? Are we watching what happened? Or are we watching analysis about what happened? And being able to understand the distinction and the distinction between commentary and reporting. These things are really important. When it comes to a situation with something like Walmart entering a town, Walmart's just providing people what they want. So there is responsibility amongst people who are making choices, and they have responsibility for those choices, for sure. There's also a set of systems and an asymmetry of power between Walmart as an actor in that situation and other individuals. The aggregate power of the individuals is very large, but if it's not well organized, the balance of power between an actor like Walmart and an actor like an individual shopper is very, very great. And the same is true around how we consume information in terms of as a single user of a tool like Facebook, I have zero power. And so the idea that Facebook's just feeding me what I want is a little bit of blaming the reader for being human. And I think is an incomplete understanding of who's responsible for what. If Walmart's first step was, what does this community need? Their behavior might be different. But that's not their first step. That's not what they're incentivized to do as a business. It's not. It's not. They don't behave that way for a reason, because it's a more effective market entry solution than just come into the society, come into the community, not ask questions. Right?
I hate to beat up the analogy, but I do think it's almost exactly the same question as a Facebook versus its users kind of question. If collectively the community decides that Walmart is great and wants to take advantage of it, then why is Walmart not reflecting what the community needs?
It might be. In the case of Facebook, I don't get to see my choices. Facebook sees my choices. I don't see my choices. And that's part of the asymmetry, right? Like, one of the questions here is, can you turn off the personalization? Like, this is one of the big sort of reasonable, like as a question of policy, as a question of what power we want to give individuals in a situation. Do I have the ability, or should I have the ability, should Facebook be required to offer me the ability to stop making all these choices for me in a totally opaque way? And that's where this sort of like, we can try to rebalance the question of power. Because I do think, to the point about understanding systems and media literacy, that there is, if we're going to be in a graph-based system where we have more power, one of the advantages here of the breakdown of gatekeepers is the incredible explosion of more voices, more capacity to tell more stories by more people than ever in the history of the world, right? And that is, from my perspective, that is a good thing. That is a source of greater creativity, greater inclusion, people having the ability to speak for themselves. All of that power, and I make this joke too many times in my book because I couldn't stop myself, it's like quoting Spider-Man, which is, with great power comes great responsibility. And are we taking that responsibility seriously as individuals? Probably not seriously enough. Is Walmart taking, or the Facebook taking their responsibility? I don't think that there's this point. I don't know that when Mark Zuckerberg was in his dorm at Harvard, like ranking girls on, the face smash, I don't know that he was thinking about like fundamentally permanently altering the public sphere of global political public discourse. I just don't think that was in his mind at the time. But he did, and he has, he now, because of the place they occupy, there's responsibility that they can either claim or not. And I think this is where you see, when Facebook says that they want new internet regulation, that is a desperate claim to not have as much responsibility as they accidentally created for themselves by being so dominant. There's a question behind you, Chris.
Yeah, so there's a lot of pieces here. I'll try to get this down to one of them.
Sure.
You talked about STP, and I agree with it. I think that's a good concept. The personalization, the hyper-personalization. But you use the example of Zuckerberg developing the first ranking system. The issue that I have is, where did he get that initial data from? And he broke into the system and he stole the data. So from my standpoint, the ability to turn on or off personalization is way too late in the process. I should have control over what they're actually putting into my profile to send me the right information, or the right ads and the targeting. But that's where I get concerned, is if I have a conversation with someone and we talk about alligators, and so I want to go research alligators and I go hit up 5 or 6 websites, the next day, maybe the next hour, I'm getting ads for something related to alligators. Well, I don't care about alligators. I was trying to do my research. And what scares me is, the more I try to become knowledgeable, the more these sites try to tell me what I should know. And so that's how do you, I feel like you guys are addressing the back end of turning off the most important thing, which is the personalized ad, versus addressing the issue of, how are you collecting the information, and why don't I have control over that information?
I think that's a great question, and I do think that this sort of question about individual agency in these models is unsolved. It's not optimized for individual agency. It's actually optimized to take away your agency and make choices for you, right? And so when I sort of talk about this sort of public discourse about what we want from these systems, one of the things that I think needs to be expressed is that we want systems to be designed for individual agency, that you do have those choices and those controls as a matter of requirement when these systems are built and exist. That is actually something we do want because it allows us to have a better sense that we have a say in our own worldview. We don't have a good coherent worldview of what we want from these systems, right? The idea that individual agency is important to us, nobody ever codified that. We may have hoped that would be true, but it's not really in Facebook's interest to give you that agency. So why would they? They're going to have to be made to do that.
So let me add to that. Actually, the concept of data ownership is starting to form with GDPR and also CCPA. So in GDPR and CCPA, you have rights to access, rights to know, right? Rights to access, rights to forget, and there's like 5 or 6 rights. So data traditionally is the mean to the end. It's not the end, right? It's a way to get to something. So traditionally, there's no this concept of identity, and also traditionally the data ownership resides with whoever holds the data. There's no such concept as the data subject, which is people who don't hold the data, but they are the subject of the data, right? The data subject, there's no this kind of concept, but since GDPR and CCPA, we're starting to have this kind of concept. Now, the problem right now is on the infrastructure part. We have a centralized infrastructure, centralized identity infrastructure. So infrastructure are basically stuff that runs these data things, right? So like it or not, your identity is basically run on Google and Facebook infrastructure. Okay, like when you log into services, most people use Google and Facebook logins. That's basically about 70-80% of the logins. Okay, so we have a centralized infrastructure system, and unlike internet, which is a decentralized system, that's why they hold so much power. And the truth is, other companies, smaller ones like Spokeo, we don't really have that power, right? Because it's a centralized system. So we can't really actually empower you to have all these identities, because at the end of the day, right now, it's held by monopolies such as Google and Facebook. So the concept of ownership is starting to come up, but after this concept of data ownership and identity ownership gets more and more mature, you start to run into this issue about the centralization or decentralization of the identity infrastructure.
Graham had a question, and there's a question in the back too.
Yeah, so I wanted to turn to the question about the issue of echo chambers and silos and the sort of distinction, I think, between sort of nuance and difference. So Michelle Goldberg had a really interesting op-ed in the New York Times yesterday, and it was titled, we should know less about each other. And it incites this really interesting research by a professor at Duke, what's his name? Christopher Bale, who basically had a sort of sample of Twitter users, classified them as Democratic or Republican, and assigned them to different, to follow a new Twitter feed for a month. And unbeknownst to them, they were like, the Democrats were assigned to a Republican Twitter feed and vice versa. And it's this idea, so many people have said this to me, like students, friends, like, it's the algorithm. It's driving me, to these silos, and I should be exposed to difference, and that'll help everything. But what this research shows is that it actually makes it worse. So you get exposed, you see all this stuff from Republicans that you don't like as a Democrat, and vice versa, and it makes you more upset and more angry at the other side, and it actually increases polarization. And so difference, exposing yourself or reversing the algorithm, in a simple way, may actually not be the solution. But getting to nuance, Michael, as you were talking about, maybe it's more interesting, right? How do you do that, right? How do you expose people in this in this environment, this is simple environment, you know, and compared to in person, where I talk to Chris, I get to see him in the flesh, I see his complexity in a conversation, but online, is it just, her claim is sort of that it's impossible, right? Like, the online environment cannot, you know, sort of encompass that nuance, and it's even the best algorithm will ever be able to sort of do that. And are there examples where, at least beginning, you know, to be able to get to that nuance rather than distance?
I think one of the challenges with it, like, I think it's a really interesting piece of research. I think that's a really sort of complex problem to try to engage with. I think the challenge is how you engage with difference and the mechanism, the expectations in terms of how you're presented a piece of information matter to how you interpret it. If we have a conversation in here where the intention is to kill the people that disagree with you, metaphorically, it will be a very different conversation than if we have a conversation in here which is about very intentionally trying to empathize with people with whom you disagree. So when you do a study about difference on Twitter, which has now a long history of norms and expectations of snap decisions and dunking on your political opponents, and then you sort of promote to people political opponents, they're going to make snap judgments and dunk on them. There's a problem. This is not an environment where there's almost any capacity to have the kind of conversation that you think that researcher thinks they're measuring. So things like a deliberative conversation where different norms are set up in a different dialogue may be required. It just may be the case that now the norms of the way political Twitter has worked now for a decade make it a bad place to have that conversation. It may be that what they discovered is that political Twitter is so toxic that difference is actually counterproductive in Twitter. I do not buy the conclusion that it means that exposing you to difference will inherently, because it's just not consistent with my experience of having conversations with people with whom I disagree, about which I may have some other, one of my things here is that seeing people in more dimensions and having other means by which we may be connected, other things that we share, help create some buffer for the difference. So maybe the case that one of the things we all share is that we're members of the Davidson community. And there's a desire to be part of something, and so we are tolerant or willing to be empathetic and listen to other forms of difference because we share something. I talk a lot about, I moved to a very small town in the middle of nowhere in upstate New York a few years ago after 20 years in downtown Chicago in liberal Democratic politics. And I now live in a sort of swing district in a small town, rural place. And I joined the volunteer fire department as a way of trying to get involved, trying to be useful, and trying to be helpful in my community. I became an EMT. The firehouse in this rural place where I work is full of who you would expect in a 100% volunteer fire department in a rural county in upstate New York, almost entirely populated by sort of what you would stereotypical working class white rural sort of New England Republicans. We get along great. Because we are first bound by a willingness to wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning if one of our neighbors falls on the floor. And then we have other kinds of conversations all the time. First of all, not all of which are political, which was interesting for me to discover. As someone who lives in political discussion too often. But it just turns out that a lot of people don't see politics as a place to find truth or community or anything productive anymore. And that's also a sad commentary on the nature of like a civic responsibility relative to participation in conversation. But the shared reason for being in community makes us tolerant of each other in ways that like the long-haired, and this is like, I cut you there. Like this is like the long-haired hippie liberal Obama guy from Chicago coming into the firehouse, like, but they don't, because I answer my fucking pager, and I show up when something is important, and I clean the ambulance, and so it's okay that I'm the long-haired hippie liberal Obama guy because I cleaned the ambulance. I did the other thing. I was of service to my community in a way that creates a little bit of capacity for understanding and empathy. And so it may be the case that we just need more dimensionality to our relationships in order to experience difference. It may be, as I was saying before, that like we look to community and storytelling for a lot of things, one of which is belonging and safety. And so if we're getting that and we're getting exposure to difference and are challenging, it may be that we can excel at a more creative, more diverse society where more voices are empowered if we can have both those things. And therefore we need spaces that are meant to be more than one thing, right? And I don't know that too much of our public sphere is governed by too much of the same mechanics, that we're only getting one experience. And it just may, I started to say this before, it may be totally fine that Instagram sends me runners and Rottweiler puppies. It may be that the economics of that type of storytelling, that as a society, we need the economics and the incentives around a complex, long-form investigative report into corruption at the Department of Justice by the Washington Post is competing differently for our attention than a cat video. It just may not be good for society that those two competitions are the same. This woman in the back had her hand up for almost half an hour. Sorry.
You mentioned economics, and I wanted to ask for a second about externalities. Has anybody brought that up already? Because that is a way of objectively taking a framework that we have already met, like with the EPA, et cetera, and placing it on this new technology. We're going to make money off of it. We have to we know we can quantify some of the problems that have occurred. We don't have to have Facebook solve all of them. Maybe entrepreneurs can do that, but Facebook.
I think that's a great, who's responsible for the externalities? And in a lot of cases, one of the challenges with the mechanisms by which we have invested in and driven a lot of this innovation, venture-backed capital and other kinds of spaces, is that the externalities of disruption are borne by others, largely the public. And is it important that those externalities are accounted for in the economics of innovation? I think maybe the answer is yes. And it doesn't, I don't expect Facebook. There are really smart, good, thoughtful people at Facebook working on these problems, understanding these problems. Mrs. Haugen is an example of that. I don't expect Facebook to solve these problems for us. They're just not likely to do it alone. In an environment where these problems become solvable because there's a different regulatory framework in mind, and there are different constraints and requirements like individual agency starting to be imposed on what we demand and what we want from these systems, other people will be able to be creative. This is my problem. The challenge around monopoly for me is less about prices, which is how we tend to think about the costs of monopoly traditionally in antitrust situations, right, like Standard Oil, sort of like an older industrial view of monopoly. The cost of monopoly to me right now is a lack of innovation, lack of the ability of creativity and new ideas to sort of pierce this very, very narrow control and power dynamic that Harrison talked about around identity and data. And so that, I do think that other people may become responsible for some of these externalities if we're willing to let them, might be how I say it. Oh, no, okay.
We got one.
Oh, well, I guess I have the last question. I'm lucky.
Better be good.
Yeah, so getting back to, is it an individual change or like a company policy to change what we're really talking about? I don't want to say this, but I'm going to say this. I feel like DeFi and that whole DeFi community with crypto and how they're approaching things is really driven by individuals who've looked at a system and said, this is silly, we have blockchain, there's better ways to do things, and they're building it, and they're just creating a new way to look at things when it comes to finance. Using the Walmart example that gentleman brought up in the thread, they're fulfilling a need for lower cost products in a community. I don't think that's an easy thing to fill, but I do think what DeFi is doing is it's people with good intentions building something new and replacing something that really doesn't need to be there anymore. What are your thoughts on individual versus policy, and do you think DeFi is an individual effort in your mind?
I almost always land on the both and versions of questions like this. I hate to be, so that, this may not be the most interesting answer to this question, which is, yeah, I think individual responsibility matters a lot. I think institutional actors with lots of power also have responsibility and need to accept it and use it and leverage it in important ways. I think one of the challenges around disrupting finance is that is it possible for individual actors, does the system make it possible for those individual actors to actually disrupt the larger system? Maybe in this case, not so far, right? So we're still measuring the value of most cryptocurrency in dollars, right? It may be the case that many of the sort of decentralization principles we just haven't gotten to yet. So it's just early, and we haven't developed new language or new mechanisms for transfer and that kind of thing. But like our habit about sort of a basic fiat sort of currency are so ingrained it's taking us a while. So it may be the case that the answer here in that case is not yet. But it also may be the case that like the regulatory framework in which they're operating also has to be changed in order for the possibility of the individual innovation to actually be a meaningful option, right? Like proof of concept option is interesting, but isn't necessarily transformative unless the system is capable of being transformed. I think in many cases, there are lots of cases in politics right now where we talk about, we use the language of transformation to talk about very incremental change. We're not really talking about the underlying system. I think that's a trap. And I worry that like an either or answer to this is also a trap. That's all.
I actually agree. I think you need both. A lot of times you need kind of laws and regulations to set the principles, the underlying principles to move things along. Because when the economics or certain mechanisms move in a certain way, and you want to change that direction, a lot of times it does take that, right, to change the direction. So I think CCPA, GDPR, like we're actually very, very supportive of it. Now, sometimes the laws dictates like what you need to do. For example, personally, I really don't like the GDPR's like a cookie pop-up, right? I go to all these websites that pop up all the time. I was like, David, like I already know what cookie does. Maybe they stop showing me that. So that's where I personally think these laws and regulations really overstep. And I think, generally speaking, because laws like usually is a long-making process of getting everyone's consensus. So it should be setting the principles, and then the individuals and companies and things like that can actually implement these principles. So I think the solution to your question, in my opinion, I actually agree with Michael here, is that I think you need both.
Awesome. Well, just in the interest of scheduled time here, I just want to, I'll trade.
Sorry about the mics today, guys.
Awesome. So there we go. I just wanted to thank Michael and Harrison for coming out tonight. We have a couple, I know you guys are flying, they traveled in, so Harrison came in from California for this, and Michael came in from New York, rural New York. And we thank the volunteer fire department for letting us have their time. So if anyone has any questions, we can hang out for a little bit and chat after this, but I just wanted to kind of end the formal portion of the event. And again, thanks so much, guys. And this has been, again, I don't know, I came out with more questions than anything, but
You knew that was gonna happen.
stepping in the right direction. We're going to wrap my head around all this, and hopefully I gather from all the questions, I get the sense everyone else kind of feels the same. So thanks again.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.